lovelies, and welcome back to my channel. I'm so excited to share with you my topic for today, which is disability narratives in fantasy, and we're going to break down some tropes. But before we get into that, I want to give you a small update. If you are new to my channel, my name is Isa, and I am a disabled scholar, advocate, and writer, and I am actually currently packing up to head back to Texas, which I will be leaving in 8 days. My mom and I are going to head to Vero Beach this weekend for a hopefully social distance kind of vacation thing before I go back to school. And we scheduled that way ahead of time before the COVID rate started going up, and it's too late to kind of go back. So fingers crossed, I'll be vlogging that. And I will also be vlogging my trip to Texas, and I'm so excited because my apartment, which is considered graduate student housing, is fully accessible, and I've never lived in a fully accessible apartment before, and I'm an ambulatory wheelchair user, so hopefully this is going to make things super easy in the transition to my first apartment. Gonna be great. So anyway, look out for those vlogs coming out. I'm going to be trying to post things every Thursday, but I might take a break shortly after I get there just to get settled in. So let's get into today's video. This summer, my siblings got me into that Owl House, and as I've been watching it, one thing that I heard frequently is how the main character and her mentor are kind of coded for disability. And while I kind of saw the coding, and I'll be talking about the coding in a little bit, the thing that really got me was this last episode, which is the one after Ida's Requiem, I think. Before I jump too far into this is a media analysis video, and because of that, there are spoilers everywhere. Most things have been out for a while, so we should be good, but I will be talking about the episode after Ida's Requiem on Owl House, so if you don't want to hear about that, then you're just gonna have to skip this intro. So, I was watching Ida's Requiem yesterday, I think, and it was really powerful. I had heard that Ida is supposed to be coded for disability. I'd seen some of that coding before, but it was so strong in this episode. And to see how the show kind of explores in a coded way the complex relationship a person may have with a chronic or progressive illness was really powerful. But, as you know, a critical scholar, always about with me, it really got me thinking about representation in media overall. Just there's a part of me that really loves that coded representation. Ultimately, there are restrictions to coding. And like all other forms of fantasy that I've experienced growing up, in order to fully self-impose myself into that fantasy world, I have to cut out a piece of my experience. I have to cut off my disability from my identity in the way that I would interact with that world when it's such a foundational element of how I interact in this one. In the past, when I've talked about this issue in creative writing circles, a lot of the responses have been, well, people just don't want to hear disability stories, they're just boring in a fantasy realm, or that non-marginalized people become isolated if you focused on marginalized identities and experiences. And just thinking about the way that the Owl House is coded, and thinking about a lot of the media that I've consumed this past year and overall in my lifetime, it's really got me thinking and come to this realization that really, truly, fantasy loves disability narratives, but very rarely do we actually get to see disabled characters and identities and experiences true to form. So today I'm going to talk about some of the less discussed disability tropes in fantasy, and really dive deep into some of the things that I personally find problematic, or things that I think could be better or just improve the genre overall. I want to give a big disclaimer. A lot of this stems from my own personal opinion and experiences and what I would personally look for representation, so it does not reflect all disabled people or disabled narratives. I also want to urge you to decentralize whiteness in our understanding of disability, and I know that has restrictions coming from me, that I have restrictions on how much I'm able to eloquently describe how to do that. I strongly recommend checking out Cartoons and Spice. He talks about this at length, but ultimately disability should be understood from an intersectional lens, especially as other marginalized identities are more likely to become disabled through the oppressive systems that they experience. With my disclaimers out of the way, let's dive in. So the first trope that I want to talk about is disability coding. So disability coding is where a character is coded as disabled. We're supposed to see them as disabled in this world without actually using the terms disability and those specific experiences. So the big thing that I have a problem with disability coding is when disability coding happens because a person does not have magic. The TV show The Nevers has an example where a character is blatantly disabled. They are the only wheelchair user in the entire show and the only blatantly disabled character in the entire show, and yet they're one of the few characters who does not have magic. And typically that association isn't so blatant, and sometimes it's more subtle with coding. We see that in discussions of the Squib in Harry Potter, where people are born into magical families who are non-magical. They don't have access to magic, so they have to find other ways of going about it, or they just have to retreat overall, and they don't get to access this world around them because there's something innately wrong with them, is typically how this coding goes. The Owl House has a more positive form of this coding. A lot of people suggest that the main character, Luz, is disability coded because she cannot access magic in the same way that everybody else does, which ultimately has some positive elements in the way that the Owl House plays with it. But my problem with the Owl House and its disability coding this way is that the more that Ida, Luz's mentor, becomes more disabled, more in connection with her curse that kind of disables her, the less powerful she becomes. And ultimately, what I struggle with when characters are coded as disabled because of their lack of access to magic is that magic isn't just like, being able to walk or being able to do certain things in a traditional or normal way. It is, to us, magic is something special. It is the spark, it is the thing that is unique and interesting, and how each character, especially in Owl House, has kind of their own little niche that they play with, and they have their own style. All of these things are represented, which is really cool, and then when our main character doesn't have immediate access or innate access to it, it's just really frustrating. And I think the Owl House is an example that could be good on its own if it wasn't such a common trope in so many different narratives, that the only type of disability coding we get is this lack of innate specialness, which is a common dangerous stereotype about people with disabilities. The next fantasy trope that I want to talk about is magical marginalization, which occurs all the time. It's a very common trope and typically used as a way to code characters for marginal identities without ever having to explicitly say this. The most common and direct example that I can think of right off the bat is X-Men. The magical oppression in X-Men is very specifically done in a way to engage people who feel less represented in media. However, it is still restricted by its origins. Thankfully, we have had more own voice creators in X-Men who can engage with the comics. However, in movies and the TV shows, we commonly see the same kind of tropes and themes across the board for different marginalized identities. But the thing about X-Men that I find particularly interesting about disability, or its relationship to disability in the way that it's magical marginalization, is that it is a mutation. It occurs in the body, and even when I was a young kid, when I learned that I had a genetic mutation, and I heard and understood that concept of a mutation, it clicked to me like, I'm an X-Men. I've got superpowers. I was so excited as a kid because I'm like, this is me. This is my representation. But ultimately, it falls short in a lot of ways because it's like, oh, we represent everybody without actually discussing it. In X-Men, this actually really hurts the world building because ultimately what we have is, this exploration of this genetic mutation without ever kind of discussing how that might affect other genetic mutations or how that might affect other disabilities, especially since powers are such an embodied experience. Why aren't we seeing that reflected in disability experiences? And yet they still use disability tropes and narratives. X-Men stories really love to explore a lot of dangerous associations with disability, that things that you have to consider when you're disabled. Like, what does it mean to not have control over your body? What does it mean to not have full autonomy? What does it mean to potentially suffer at the hands of someone else's curiosity, or be experimented on, or be dependent on the scientists and the doctors around you when you know more about your own experience? All of these things are very common disability experience that X-Men movies and X-Men TV shows like to play with as a concept, but never actually does the work to dive into the disability experience and actually represent disabled voices or questions, or how people with disabilities actually deal with these things. Ultimately, again, cheapening the experience of the story itself. Gifted, which is a TV show about some young mutants, kind of addressed this a little bit in season 2, episode 8, where the main character family has to go to a lab to figure something out with the dad, and then at that lab, the person who's running it actively works with people who, she uses the term even, who are disabled by their power. And it even makes the distinction with a character with Down syndrome to say, hey, this character with Down syndrome doesn't need to be cured. Just because she has Down syndrome doesn't mean that she doesn't have the autonomy to make choices with her powers. And it was really refreshing to see in that one scene, but the problem even then, that's where it ends. We get to go on at the lab, but we never address the fact that they're talking about people with disabilities. We don't actually talk about the disability experience, even though the main characters are kind of walking that line of these are very common experiences that people with disabilities have. And yet we never get to dive into them. Overall, what happens is, while there are some really good narratives and there's some subtle representation that a young teenager who's desperate for any type of representation might connect to, what's going on is that it reinforces ableist ideas, because you're kind of playing with the concept and then pushing it aside, reinforcing these kind of ableist ideas of like, what is it to be worthy of function? What is it worthy to be worthy of autonomy? And that's a really important discussion, especially given everything that's happened with COVID. This is another example of magical marginalization, except Joss Whedon took it to a whole new special level. A showrunner described the Nevers as a Victorian lady X-Men, which it basically is. Another example where this group of people get powers, they're marginalized for it, they face all these challenges and difficulties because of it. However, I got really excited about seeing the trailer for the Nevers before I figured out who was running it, and I still watch the show because I have no self-control when it comes to things that kind of align with the Freak Show. Because the trailer kind of promised an exploration of this concept of the Freak Show. The Freak Show is intimately connected to the disability experience, and it punctuates every type of disability representation we currently see in media. Nevers is particularly unique because of the way that it pulls directly from disability narratives and dialogue, such as the scene that I'm about to share with you today. So they go to the opera, two of the characters who are touched, which is their version of mutants. They go to the opera at the invitation of this lady, and in order to kind of say, like, look, the touched can be prim and proper and all of that other stuff. And this kind of interaction ensues amongst other things that are very directly, like, things that have come out of my own mouth with people. So the antagonist in this scene goes, I take it then that you are yourselves among the afflicted. Then the main character goes, touched, yes, we don't consider ourselves afflicted. The antagonist says, perhaps some women are more fortunate in their nature of ailment than others. And then the main character says, that's true, but more suffer from society's perception than their own debilitation, which is very directly, kind of almost weirdly directly, a way of describing the social model of disability. And you can find that literally everywhere on the internet. It is a discussion that I have had with people. So it was just very odd to hear this type of dialogue in any type of fiction, but particularly in this fantasy world. Which made me excited and cautious because seemingly everyone in that production was non-disabled. And maybe if Joss Whedon ended the kind of magical marginalization there with just kind of pulling from that dialogue to try to add more flavor to the story, it wouldn't be as bad as it ended up being. But ultimately, of course, we could not. The example that I'm about to talk about next is very reminiscent of violence against a disabled individual from a loved one. So if that is something that is potentially triggering for you, I'm going to hold up this purple thing while I'm talking about it, and then as soon as I'm done, I will take it down, and that way you can mute it or you can skip the video as long as I have it up. Ultimately, your choice, whatever makes you feel safe and good. So even displays violence that is very commonly displayed against disabled people, particularly from loved ones. There's a scene where they're trying to figure out what's going on, and someone is making this character tell the truth, and in that scene all of these touched individuals are in the room, and they get to hear about how this woman drowned her daughter because she was touched, which if you just do a quick Google search, you will see how common that is, especially with people who are autistic. You can hear stories all the time of autistic people being murdered by their parents and loved ones and caretakers and other disabled people because it's just too much to care for them or love them or just treat them as a human being. Ultimately, what I felt about this show was that instead of using actual disabled experiences to talk about it in a delicate manner that it deserved, it was very commodified. It was a very cheap way of just trying to sell the story that was very difficult to just kind of see being brushed over instead of being addressed with the severity that it should have been. These are just a few examples of the way that fantasy likes to use disabled narratives and stories. And even if you probably did a quick search of disabled characters, a lot of these characters don't identify as disabled. You never hear the word disability. You never see them in difficult situations where they're having to address the needs of accessibility and accommodation and things like that. Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood is an example, has a disabled character from beginning to end, and yet we never really get to see a full development of those narratives from the perspective of disability, and it's largely because the showrunners and the people who are creating them aren't non-disabled, and they only understand disability from the perspective of fear and their need to have this cathartic release and exploration of disability. But ultimately that just reinforces the fears. And the thing that I struggle with the most is that these narratives ultimately reinforce these horrific ideas of quality of life and who deserves to live, because we only understand disability from this like very restricted mindset, because you have these disabled characters who are empowered and who should be represented as disabled characters, but yet no one sees them as disabled because they're not marketed that way. Even if they are disabled on a plain level because they're missing limbs or they're using a wheelchair, they're not seen as disabled. And it's because they're not pairing the disabled body with disabled narratives. And it's one or the other, and ultimately what you're doing is you're cutting things on either direction and making the story cheaper. You're making the narratives overall more boring, and you're not representing the people who need to be represented. Too often when I watch videos about what's necessary to represent disabled characters or what is good representation, a lot of this stuff is just cutting out any opportunity to have a nuanced discussion about disability beyond I'm more than my disability. For me, my disability makes up a lot of my life. A lot of my life is spent managing and understanding and trying to maneuver it. And when I want to go out with friends, I have to think about my disability. And when I want to make plans 2 weeks ahead of time, I have to think about my disability. So it's just difficult to see all of these people say, oh, this is disability representation and this is disability coding, when you never actually get to hear the true stories, which ultimately would make things a lot easier. And I think the foundation of that problem is the fact that we make media for non-disabled audiences. Even when stories are good, there are restrictions to metaphors. And if the argument against the things that I've been saying is the fact that ultimately these stories are true to sell and most audiences are non-disabled, then first off, 20% of the population is disabled, or will, and most everyone will become disabled at some point in their life. Obviously, from the narratives that we've seen, people are interested in disability stories. But aside from that, representation does not have to be exact. For example, Honey Girl, which is about a Black woman in academics, and it's a sapphic novel, and it really explores her relationship with academics. I deeply identified with that story, even though I can recognize that the things that she experienced as a Black woman is very different from the things that I experience as a disabled woman, but there are the intersections that, yeah, things are difficult when you're the first person in your department who's ever done this type of research, or the first person with your identity. And those things didn't have to come from this cheaply, artificially made space, because ultimately the author is an own voice author. All you think about when it comes to representing marginalized identities is that people are not going to be able to empathize with those characters, then obviously you aren't considering those characters as full-rounded characters, because ultimately people want to connect with other people. If Black, Indigenous kids, people of color can grow up reading about white kids, and queer kids can grow up reading and watching all these stories about straight stories and cis stories, I don't see why we have to make such a big deal about what the non-marginalized audience wants and needs. This is especially important in children's media. Why can't we just represent the people who actually need representation in its entirety and show those full narratives? Why can't we let them be the forerunners and the writers and the voice actors? Besides the fact that we're not ready to disengage the power structures that already exist. So when we think about media, when people talk about media just being fiction, it's not just fiction. It represents the power structures that currently exist in our world, which is why it's so important to deconstruct them. And disability and the things that I've talked about today, there's just one portion of that. And the more intersectional experiences and the more intersectional own voice writers and producers that we can get when it comes to disability experiences, the more vibrant and important and just incredible stories we're gonna get, because those are the interesting stories that we're not currently hearing. People are talking about being tired of the same old tropes, then maybe hand it to different types of authors. If you need an example of how an own voice author can really reinvent the way that we see fantasy, and just kind of take some normal tropes that we normally see and just change it, and make the world building so rich from their personal experience, I strongly recommend Legend Board by Tracy Deonn, because it is exactly what I aspire to do if I ever have the opportunity to fully write a fantasy novel, and that is explore fantasy from my experience and own my experience, because what makes my identity different than the majority is ultimately what can make fantasy stories truly incredible. So I strongly urge you, if you are a fantasy writer, to write those stories, write from your perspective, talk about how your specific identities may interact with the fantasy world, because those things are what can make fantasy so much more rich and break the tropes that we normally see. And I think it's what's gonna save fantasy overall from being the same old thing over and over and over again.